Hey everybody, welcome to the third episode of the Balsa USA Beginner Build Series. I wanted to cover a couple of quick things with you before we get started to let you know what I was doing. I'm actually going to go ahead and skip the engine mount portion of my build for right now. The great folks over at Habaco are sending along an OS46FX for this build, and I'm going to wait till it arrives here before I do my engine rails. Now you can go ahead and you can follow along with me. There's going to be nothing critical left in the front of the airframe that's going to keep you from mounting your engine later. If you want to, when that video comes out, you can skip to it and go along with the instructions if you'd like, but again, there's nothing critical that's going to keep you from going ahead and working along with us. Now, I wanted to also let the people know that the electric conversion kit prototype is going to be ready very soon. We've got a little bit of R&D left to do with it. I'm going to do some research on some motor sizes and some ESCs, and also what batteries and where the CGE might come out. So that's something that we're going to have the information to follow along with very soon. Stay tuned for that for those of you that want to do the electric conversion. Now, with the electric conversion, just so you know, you can go ahead and build the rest of the airframe and add the electric conversion at the end. You're not going to hurt anything. There's not going to be any critical that you need to do. We might have to do a couple of small modifications to the fuselage for fitting the battery, but it's not going to be anything that you're going to need to worry about. So you can go along and work with us through the rest of the video and you should be fine. Okay, let's get started. Thanks very much for joining in, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. So now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and install the nose gear bearing. I'm going to use these 440 by ½ inch screws here. What I will do on these, anytime I have a screw that I have going in to metal, I'm going to go ahead and use a little bit of thread locker on them just to make sure they stay put. I'm going to do this one in glow, so it's going to have quite a bit of vibration to it, and I don't want these to come loose. So I will use a little bit of Loctite on these bolts or screws. So the next step in the instructions is going to be to drill a 5/32 diameter hole through the fuselage sticks. Now what they're looking for is, as you can see right here, this is my gear block, and this is the center line that I drew on my gear block. What they're needing you to do is right here, as close to the line as you can get, behind the line on one side and in front of the line on the other side. What that's going to do is that's going to put the hole that your landing gear fits in for the tricycle gear. Okay, so again, you want to get as close to the line as you can, one in back of the line on one side and one in front of the line on the other side. Now the important thing to keep in mind is you're going to want to try to drill this hole as vertical as you possibly can. So you really want to make sure you have your drill up and down. A lot of drills these days has a level in the back. This one that I have doesn't happen to have one. So I'm just going to make sure that I hold it as vertical as I can, and I'm going to drill the hole right in the middle of the fuselage sticks. Just like that. That is all there is to it. So I can show you what this is going to look like. I will grab my landing gear out of my wire package and show you exactly what it is they're looking for. So what it'll look like when you get done is that one gear goes in this side and one gear goes in this side. Now depending on your drills, you may need to open that hole up a little bit. Don't go too crazy with it because you want that to fit relatively snug. So that right there is what the gear block is going to look like when we get done. Just like that. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to cut out the inside of each of these holes on both sides towards the gear block so that it clears the radius that's on your gear here. Okay, this will make sure that you set flush against your gear block when you're done. So all you have to do is take your hobby knife and just take a little bit off the inside radius of that hole that you drilled. You don't have to take off very much. You don't want to make the hole too big, but just a little bit should be good. Once you do that to both sides, then you'll be good to go. Your gear will fit just like it's supposed to. Again, you don't want to take too much off of there. Just enough so it clears that radius. And what I would do as you do this, I would test fit it a couple times just to make sure it fits where you want to. When you tighten down your gear to the gear block in a couple of steps from now, you do want it to have a little bit of retention to it. So you want it to be a little stiff, but you don't want it to be stiff enough that when you land the first time it pulls your screws out of your gear block. So just give it a little bit of extra right there, and then test fit your gear. Now keep in mind, you don't want to drill those holes all the way through. You only need to drill them through just enough to clear this. Okay? You could put a piece of tape on your drill. You could get the depth. So if you wanted to, you could take your drill here and hold it up to your gear and place a piece of tape on your drill bit for your depth if you want to. Just make sure that you don't need to drill it all the way through. However you want to do that works just fine. So now I'm just going to test fit my gear. Just like that. And that to me looks good. Those wires are both laying down up flush against my gear block, so that when I put my screws in, they should be just fine. Okay, so now the next step is going to be to lay the bottom plywood sheet in place and mark it with the width of the nose gear bearings as shown, and cut the 1/8 inch deep notch that goes around your gear plate. So what you need to do is you need to get the gear plate in position. Now, what you'll see here is if I put it to there, you can see that I'll have a little gap right here. So what I would suggest doing is moving it up to about right there. So what that does is that puts that bottom plywood piece flush with your F1 former. Then all you need to do at that point is measure the depth of the gear block in the front. So right here I'm getting 1/8 of an inch. So that will be a good starting point for your notch. So if you bring that up flush with your F1 former, you can mark your line just like this right here. So I'm marking the corner of the gear block on both sides. And then what I'll do is I'll measure in 1/8 of an inch on both sides, and then that way I can get the bottom ply put all the way flush against the F1 former before I make my marks to cut out the rest of the gear block. So what I've done here is I've made those 2 marks, and I know that they're in the center because I made sure I was flush on both sides here and here. So I use my ruler here and just come in 1/8 of an inch on both sides to make my cut line mark. So I make a mark there, 1/8 of an inch, And I come over here and I do the same thing. Make a mark, 1/8 of an inch, and then I use my straight edge to connect the mark on both sides. And that's going to be the starting point for my notch. So now all you have to do is take your Zona saw and very carefully cut up to the mark you made. So there's my 1/8 of an inch on both sides. Just like that. And then I can get my cutting board and use my utility knife. Now it'll take a couple of passes to get through this with your utility knife. Don't try to cut too much at one time, because then you'll end up splintering the wood. Takes a little patience. Slowly work your way through. Now if you wanted to try to use any other tools that you have available to you, that would be perfectly fine. Some people cut this off with maybe a Dremel. I would suggest with something like this that you just cut it by hand, because you can get too much with the Dremel. You can cut too much off, and just a couple of passes and I'm able to remove that extra there, and that gives me my notch. Then you can clean this up with your utility knife. So be careful that you again sneak up on your edges, so that way you don't run into troubles later with having too many gaps. So now you can see that'll fit flush up against my F1 former here, and then I can make my marks to cut the rest of the slot that I need out for the gear block. So at this part, what you want to do is you want to go in here and mark the round portion of the nose gear bearing. Just trace right around it. And what that'll do is it'll give you your spacing for your nose gear bearing. So now what you're going to want to do is you're going to cut this piece out so that it fits around your nose gear bearing. Okay, so now in my case, what I have is I have a Dremel sanding drum that is almost a perfect match for that rounded out section. So I'm going to use my Dremel sanding drum on this portion. You can cut this out with a hobby knife. You'll just have to take a couple of hits through it, and once you get it down a little bit, you should be able to break it right out of there. You can do that. You can use a drill bit and drill into it right here if you want, and then clean it up with your hobby knife afterwards. There's all kinds of options. So whatever tools you have available to you, go ahead and use what you have to cut this circle out. Now, this half circle out. Now for me, as I said, my Dremel sanding drum is almost the exact size. It actually fits perfectly. So I'm just going to use my Dremel sanding drum to get that radius cut. I am, of course, going to put on my RZMask Spitfire dust mask. I do suggest anytime you're going to use a radial tool or any kind of sanding that you do protect yourself. There will be a video coming up here soon on some of the options that are available to you, but I do suggest that you always wear some kind of breathing barrier when you're sanding and working with rotary tools. You also want to make sure you have a good set of safety glasses. So as you can see, my Dremel sanding drum made quick work of the notch that I needed for my gear block. So now, when I put it up there, it's a perfect fit. So now the next step is going to be to get your gear lined up with the line that's on your gear block. Place your already cut bottom plywood down and make a mark using your straight edge with the gear. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my gear on this side, because as you can see, that's my front wire. I'm going to use the gear on that side to make my mark. Now what I'm going to do is something that I talked about in one of the first videos, is I'm going to mark it just like that. And then I'm going to use my combination square to finish that line. What you have to remember is the back gear is behind. So this is the line we're going to line up with. You don't want to try to make a mark here and make a mark here, because then your line's going to follow that angle. You want the straight angle here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my combination square here. And I'm just going to continue that line from the one gear all the way across. Now I know that line is straight and square with that piece of plywood. So now it's just a simple matter of cutting my straight line. You can see I've got my cutting board down here. I just line up my Zona saw to that line and cut the line. And it lines up perfectly. Okay, so now the next step, it says glue the leftover piece of the bottom sheet in place behind the landing gear wires as shown. This is step 17. It says this piece should be about 1.5 inches long. So now what you can do is cut another piece 1.5 inches long that will go right here. Okay, so simply all you need to do is measure back 1.5 inches on both sides. If you're using a combination square, you only have to mark one side, and then you can use your combination square to finish that line. You don't have to measure twice. You just place the combination square down on the edge of the board, making sure it's square and level, and mark your line. And again, all we need to do at this point is use our cutting board and our Zona saw and cut our line. And as you can see here, we have a perfect fit. Okay, so now what the next step is going to be is to install your nylon landing gear straps. I've already got mine installed here. All you need to do is use the nylon landing strips to make your holes on both sides. Drill those in about 1/2 inch from both sides so you get a good bite on the hardwood block that's underneath. Drill the holes using a 1/16 inch drill bit as vertical as you can. Then what I would do is take a little bit of thin CA and drop in each hole. Once you let the CA set for a second, go ahead and install your 3/4 inch sheet metal screws on all 4 places. You don't want to tighten these down too tight because you don't want to strip the holes out. So one of the things you may need to do is you may need to file the burr off of the end of the landing gear. When we produce these, they sometimes get a little burr on the end. You're going to want to make sure you use a little file and file that burr clean so that your wheel and your wheel collar will both fit. Shouldn't have to work on it very much. The burr is usually pretty insignificant, and you should be able to get it off there with no problem at all. Now you take your wheel collar with your set screw and check it to see if it fits. We're good to go. I would put a little bit of Loctite on the set screw and tighten this down. Well, gang, that's going to do it for this episode. Make sure you post any questions you have on the build in the comments, and be sure you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.